At a forward base near Loch Ninh, on the evening of the 2nd of May, 1968, a doctor leaned over a body and reached for the zipper of the bag. The man inside had been carried off a helicopter and laid in a row with the other dead. His uniform was soaked dark. His face was opened, his jaw broken, and he had lost so much blood that he could not speak and could not see. There was no reason on earth to think he was alive. He had been shot, torn by grenade fragments, run through with a bayonet, and clubbed across the head with a rifle, and the men who carried him and had counted him among the killed. The doctor had other wounded to reach and the living to save. He bent to close the bag over the face, and the man inside, who could not lift an arm or form a single word, did the one thing still left to him. He spat, blood and spit, enough to land on the doctor's hand, enough to stop the zipper. The body in the bag was a Special Forces staff sergeant named Roy Benavidez, and a few hours earlier he had not even been on the mission. He had climbed onto a helicopter with a medical bag and a knife and ridden it back across a border of the United States, said it never crossed. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand how a breathing man ends up in a body bag, you have to start with the kind of war he was fighting, because it was a war the record was built to hide. By the spring of 1968, the fighting in South Vietnam had a shadow running beside it along the western border. The Tet Offensive had torn through the country a few months earlier, hitting cities and bases that were supposed to be safe, and it had changed how the war was understood back home, even as the American command counted it a battlefield defeat for the enemy. But the slower, quieter war along the frontier never stopped. The North Vietnamese army moved men and supplies south through Laos and Cambodia, two countries the United States had publicly sworn to leave alone, down the web of roads and footpaths that Americans called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Where that trail crossed into the Cambodian salient, the enemy ran forward base areas and a headquarters that American intelligence labeled COSVN, and from that ground they could rest, refit, and strike into South Vietnam almost at will, then slip back across a line the Americans were not allowed to follow. Commanders needed to know what was massing in those sanctuaries, and the only way to know was to put eyes on the ground. So the job went to small reconnaissance teams, a few Americans, and a handful of indigenous fighters, dropped by helicopter in a ground that belonged entirely to the enemy. Then the helicopter left. There was no front line behind them. There was no artillery on call and no relief column on the way. There was the team, the jungle, and an enemy that could outnumber them 100 to 1. Benavidez served with one of the units that ran this work. The official record names a Detachment B-56, a project codenamed Sigma, under the 5th Special Forces Group. Popular accounts often file him under SOG, the Studies and Observations Group, whose deliberately dull name covered the cross-border secret war, and the line between the two outfits is blurrier in the retelling than it was on paper. The distinction matters less than the work, which was identical in spirit. Go where the Army was not supposed to be, and come back with proof. That single word, proof, is what put a team on the ground that morning, because the mission carried a political edge. Find the enemy's supply network in the sanctuaries, and bring back something the world's press could not argue with. It is worth pausing on what these reconnaissance teams actually were, because the shape of the unit explains the shape of the battle. A team was small on purpose, usually 2 or 3 Americans and a handful of indigenous fighters, light enough to move quietly and to disappear in a ground where a larger force would be spotted at once. The indigenous men were the heart of it. Many were Montagnard tribesmen from the Central Highlands. Others were Nung, ethnic fighters with their own long history of war, recruited and led by special forces and trusted with the most dangerous work the war had to offer. They knew terrain no American could read and moved through it like water. The North Vietnamese understood exactly how much damage these teams could do, and by 1968, they had built dedicated counter-reconnaissance companies whose only job was to hunt them, to surround a compromised team fast, and to ring the likely landing zones with anti-aircraft fire so that no rescue could get in. Cross-border recon developed a reputation for extraordinary lethality, and the figures that still circulate about it are striking. But they belong in the category of wartime claim rather than settled fact. inflated in the heat of action, and impossible to check against enemy records that were never opened. What is not in dispute is the price the men paid, and the 2nd of May would put that price on grim display. All of this sat under the 5th Special Forces Group, the Green Beret command that ran the war's irregular and covert ground operations in Vietnam. Its men trained and led tens of thousands of indigenous soldiers through the Civilian Irregular Defense Group program, built camps along the borders, and supplied the small detachments, B-56 among them, that pushed across the line. The piece of ground that drew the team on the 2nd of May was part of the Cambodian border salient northwest of Saigon, the region of base areas and trail that American planners eyed for years and would not openly invade until 1970. It was, in every sense that mattered, the enemy's backyard. A major North Vietnamese formation lived and refitted there, behind the protection of a border the Americans had promised to respect, and that protection is exactly what made it worth the terrible risk to put a team on the ground and learn what was massing. Benavidez's detachment existed to take that risk. The men who flew them understood it. Everyone involved knew, going in, that the odds of a clean mission in that ground were poor and the odds of a hard one were good. The men who flew these teams in and out were a unit of their own with their own cost to bear. The job of inserting and extracting Sigma's recon teams fell largely to the 240th Assault Helicopter Company, a Huey outfit that carried the nicknames Greyhounds and Mad Dogs and flew out of a base at Bearcat. In the spring of 1968, several of their aircraft and crews were attached to Detachment B-56 specifically to support its covert flights into Cambodia. These are not bystanders to the story that follows. They flew into the same fire the recon men were trapped in, and 3 of the company's crewmen would not survive the 2nd of May. Here the record asks for a correction that tells you a great deal. The Medal of Honor citation, read aloud at the Pentagon years later, places the action in a dense jungle area west of Loc Ninh, Vietnam. Later accounts are plainer about what west of Loc Ninh actually meant. The team had crossed into Cambodia, by several accounts around 10 to 12 miles inside it, near the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The careful geography in the citation was not a mistake. It was the cover. The men who did this work operated as ghosts by design, stripped of anything that could tie them to the United States, because a single dog tag recovered by the enemy could be paraded before the world as proof that Washington was lying about where its soldiers were. So the place where Roy Benavidez nearly died was, officially, a place he had never been. That fact would matter long after the shooting stopped, because a battle that did not officially happen is a hard thing for an army to hand out its highest medal for. The cost of this work was no secret to the men who did it. Casualties in the cross-border recon units ran appallingly high, nearly every man wounded at least once. Some teams, simply vanishing in a ground the United States, insisted it had never entered. They went out sterile, stripped of dog tags, name tapes, and unit patches, carrying nothing that could be traced home, because a man killed across the line could not be acknowledged as having been there at all. That was the bargain Benavidez had volunteered back into. He understood the arithmetic of the job when he climbed onto that helicopter, and he climbed on anyway. To understand why a man would take that bargain, you have to go back to where he started, because almost nothing about his beginning pointed at a Medal of Honor. He was born Raul Perez Benavidez on the 5th of August, 1935, in a small settlement called Lindenau, near Cuero in DeWitt County, Texas. His father, Salvador, was a Mexican-American sharecropper. His mother, Teresa, was Yaqui. Tuberculosis took his father when Roy was about 2, and it took his mother a few years after that, before he was 8. He and his younger brother, Roger, were sent to the town of El Campo, where a grandfather, an uncle named Nicholas, and an aunt named Alexandria raised the 2 boys alongside 8 cousins in a crowded, poor, working household. He went to work almost as soon as he was old enough to be useful. He shined shoes at the local bus station. He picked cotton and beets in the fields of Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado, riding the migrant harvest the way poor families did then. He worked in a tire shop in El Campo. School came in pieces between all of it, and he was treated, in the language of that time and place, as a dumb Mexican who did not belong in the classroom. He believed it for a while. He dropped out around the 7th grade, at about 15, to work full-time and help keep the household fed. That is the boy, an orphan, brown, poor, written off, who had already learned that nobody was coming to save him. By the genealogy people later traced, he was a descendant of the family that founded the town of Benavidez in South Texas, which is to say he came from people who had been on that land since before it was part of the United States. None of that lineage softened the present. In the El Campo of his boyhood, a brown kid in patched clothes who smelled of the fields was a brown kid in patched clothes, and the country he would one day be decorated for defending did not, in those years, fully count him as its own. He carried that contradiction for the rest of his life, and it is part of why his story sits as awkwardly in the national memory as it does. The Army was the door out. He joined the Texas National Guard in 1952, at 17, during the Korean War, and in June of 1955 he left the Guard for the regular Army and shipped to Fort Ord, California, for infantry training. By the late 1950s he had served in South Korea and in Germany, a long way in every sense from the beat fields of his childhood. While he was overseas, he kept up a correspondence with a young woman from back home, Ilaria Coy, the girl everyone called Lala, and the letters got warmer the longer he was away. When he came home, he did the old-fashioned thing. By his family's telling, he sent his uncle, his grandfather, and the parish priest to ask Lala's father for his blessing. They married on the 7th of June, 1959. They would have 3 children. He earned his jump wings, joined the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, and by his own admission, gave the Army plenty of trouble along the way with a stubborn streak and a short temper. Later, he credited exactly those traits for getting him through the brutal selection that turned ordinary soldiers into Green Berets. By the mid-1960s, the Army that had taken in a 15-year-old dropout had made him a staff sergeant and a paratrooper, and it sent him to Vietnam for the first time in 1965 as an advisor to a South Vietnamese infantry unit. Advisory duty was supposed to be a step back from the sharp end. American sergeants and officers attached to South Vietnamese units to train and steady them rather than to do the fighting themselves. In practice, it put men in the field alongside troops who were very much in the fight, and it carried its own quiet danger. It was on that duty on ground South Vietnamese soldiers held that the war first nearly killed him. He stepped on a landmine. The blast wrecked his back and legs. He was evacuated home to Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, and the doctors there told him plainly that he would not walk again. The paperwork was started for a medical discharge. This is the part of the story the body bag would echo years later, and it is worth slowing down on because it shows you the same man in a quieter room. At night, against orders, in a ward full of men who had lost limbs, he got himself out of bed and crawled on his elbows and his chin across the floor to the wall. He propped his back against it and tried to make his legs answer, beginning with his toes, then his feet, weeping from the pain by his own account, and then he did it again the next night, and the night after that for months. After more than a year, in July of 1966, he walked out of that hospital with Lala beside him. Most men would have taken the discharge and the disability and gone home to Texas with their heads high. He passed Special Forces selection instead, earned the Green Beret, and in January of 1968 went back to the war and volunteered for Detachment B, 56, the cross-border outfit with some of the worst odds in the theater. There's a legend that grows up around a man like this, and it is worth naming so the real story can stand next to it. The legend is the one-man army, the lone hero with a knife who single-handedly turned a battle. Benavidez himself spent the rest of his life pushing back against that exact picture. What the record shows is harder and better than the legend. He did not fight alone, and he did not win by killing his way out. He survived, and he kept others alive by doing the unglamorous work of a medic and a sergeant under fire, and by understanding a brutal piece of battlefield arithmetic that the rest of this story turns on. On the morning of the 2nd of May, a 12-man team went in. 3 were American Green Berets. The team leader was Sergeant First Class Leroy Wright. With him were Staff Sergeant Lloyd Mousseau, the man the others called Frenchie, and the radio operator, Specialist Brian O'Connor. The other 9 were indigenous fighters, described in different accounts as Montagnard tribesmen or Nung. And here the record carries a quiet injustice that needs saying out loud. Their names, for the most part, were never written down. They went into that fight as carefully as any of the Americans, and most of them left it without a line in the official story. These were not strangers to Benavidez. By several accounts, the men on that team were friends of his, which is part of why he did what he did when the call came. The team was on the ground only a short time before it was compromised. The jungle gave them up, and the trees came alive with North Vietnamese soldiers, a force the army later estimated at around 1,000 men, by some accounts as many as 1,500. The team called for emergency extraction. The radio plea that reached the base was not tactical and tidy. By the accounts of men who heard it, it was a human voice asking, for God's sake, to be gotten out. The 240th launched what it had, for gunships and 4 slicks, and ran them straight into a wall of fire. The helicopters could not land. They took hits on every pass, and the company was down to 3 operational aircraft before the fight was even half over. On one of those first attempts, a door gunner was killed at his gun. His name was Michael Craig, and he was 19 years old. Benavidez later remembered helping unstrap the slumped body from the aircraft, and he remembered something more particular than that. The team had celebrated Craig's 19th birthday only that March. The aircraft turned back toward Loch Ninh, leaking fluid, carrying their own dead and wounded. The men of the 240th could have been forgiven for deciding the team was lost. They had already taken hits on every pass, already lost a teenager at his gun, already watched the landing zone turn into a killing box ringed with anti-aircraft fire. Their own creed did not give them that option. They flew under the understanding that you do not leave men on the ground. And so the battered Hueys kept turning back into it, patched and refueled and crewed by men who knew exactly what the last pass had cost. Before the day was over, the company would have 3 men killed and several more wounded, and more than 36 of its members would have flown some part of the fight. The dead were the pilot Larry McKibben, the 19-year-old door gunner Michael Craig, and a crewman named Nelson Fournier. Their names belong in this story as surely as Benavidez's does, because without the men who kept flying into that fire, there was no one left for him to reach and no way to carry anyone out. And on the airstrip when they came home bleeding was a Special Forces medic who was not on the mission and had no orders to be there. Benavidez, a devout Catholic, had just come from a prayer service when he heard the radio traffic and saw the shot-up helicopters return. He grabbed an aid bag, took up a knife, and climbed onto a helicopter heading back in. He said later that he crossed himself so many times on the flight that his arms were going like an airplane propeller. He was riding toward a fight that had already killed men, into a country he was not allowed to be in, to reach a team that was, as far as anyone on that airstrip could tell, beyond saving. His faith was not a costume he put on for speeches later. He had been raised Catholic, and he kept it, and on the worst day of his life, it was the thing his hands reached for first, the sign of the cross made over and over until the gesture nearly lost its shape. People who try to explain how a man does what he did that day reach for words like training and instinct and courage, and all of those are true. But Benavidez, when he was asked, tended to point upward and outward rather than at himself. He did not believe the strength had come from him alone. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Over the team's position, the helicopter could not land. Benavidez jumped roughly 30 feet down into the brush and ran about 75 meters toward the trapped men through fire that kicked up dirt at every step. He was hit before he reached them, in the right leg, the face, and the head. He kept moving. What he found was the team broken into pieces, men dead and men dying, pinned where they lay. He took charge of what was left. He repositioned the wounded, directed their fire to clear a path for an aircraft to come in, and threw smoke to mark the spot. When an extraction ship managed to set down, he began dragging and carrying the wounded toward it, then ran alongside the aircraft as it moved, firing to keep the enemy off it. This is the arithmetic the legend leaves out, and it is the real reason any of them lived. 12 men cannot win a firefight against 1,000. They cannot trade bullets and come out ahead. What they could do was collapse the sky onto their own heads, pull the air support in so tight, and hold the perimeter so small that the killing radius of American bombs and gunfire became a wall the enemy could not cross the last few yards through. It was not a heroic stand in the movie sense. It was a controlled implosion, the team surviving by standing inside the edge of its own destruction. The thing that should have wiped them out was the only thing keeping them alive, and it worked because one wounded man on the ground kept talking the aircraft in. When blood crusted his eyes, he worked by sound. Right, the team leader was killed in the fighting. By some accounts, he died, shielding his teammates from a grenade, an act the officers who later wrote up the awards apparently did not know about at the time. Around Wright's neck was a pouch holding the radio codes and the classified instructions that could not, under any circumstances, fall into enemy hands. Benavidez crawled to the body to recover it, and as he reached it, he was hit again, shot in the abdomen and torn by grenade fragments in the back. At nearly the same moment, the pilot of an extraction helicopter, Warrant Officer Larry McKibben of the 240th, was mortally wounded and his aircraft crashed. Benavidez secured the classified pouch, made his way to the wreck, pulled the survivors out of the overturned aircraft, and gathered the stunned, bleeding men into a tight circle around the burning airframe. Then he went back to the radio and back to calling fire. He moved around that perimeter under automatic weapons and grenade fire, handing out water and ammunition he had pulled off the dead, pushing morphine into men who needed it, telling those who wanted to quit that they were going to live. He was shot again in the thigh while bandaging another wounded man, just as the next helicopter was lining up to land. When it set down, he began carrying his comrades to it one at a time. On his second trip with the wounded, an enemy soldier clubbed him from behind, breaking his jaw. In the hand-to-hand fight that followed, he was bayonet and his arms were slashed before he killed a man. Near the aircraft, he saw two more enemy soldiers rushing the craft from an angle the door gunner could not cover, and he killed them both. Only then, with almost nothing left, did he make one final crawl around the perimeter to confirm that every scrap of classified material had been recovered and every living man was aboard. Then he let himself be pulled in. By the time it was over, the fight had run something like 6 hours. Accounts of the exact tally vary, but by the most cited count, he had 37 separate wounds in him, from bullets, shrapnel, a bayonet, and a rifle butt. At least 8 men came out of that landing zone alive, because he would not stop. That is where the body bag comes in, and it is no exaggeration added for effect. He arrived at the base, so torn apart and so still that he was taken for dead and laid out with the killed, and it was the spit on the doctor's hand that sent him to surgery instead of grave. The men who pieced the day together later gave a name. They called it 6 Hours in Hell. Benavidez came out of it with injuries that would trouble him for the rest of his life, including shrapnel that stayed lodged near his heart, and a stack of Purple Hearts that did not begin to describe what those hours had been. He spent months in the hospital again, the second time in 3 years that surgeons had to rebuild a body the war had taken apart. The first time it had been a landmine. This time it was a battalion, and again he refused to let the wounds be the last word. What happened to the recognition is its own hard story, and it says something about the secret war he fought. While he was still recovering at Brooke Army Medical Center, Benavidez was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest decoration for valor. It was a high honor, and it galled him because he knew what the day had actually been. He would later say that higher awards had been given to men for far less. The reason he received the cross, and not the Medal of Honor, was procedural and cruel. The Army required a living eyewitness to the full action, and as far as anyone knew, every man who could testify to what Benavidez had done on the ground was dead. There was a quieter reason that some who lived it always suspected, and that historians have raised since. The action had taken place inside Cambodia, in a war the government would not admit to, and a full public accounting of the deed meant a full public accounting of where it happened. A medal ceremony shines a light, and the secret war was built to avoid exactly that. In 1973, as fuller accounts surfaced, a Special Forces officer named Ralph Drake pushed hard for an upgrade. By then, the time limit on the medal had run out. An appeal to Congress won a special exemption, and still the Army's Decorations Board said no, because the eyewitness requirement could not be met. For years, that was where it sat. Benavidez retired from the Army in 1976 with a total disability rating and went home to El Campo, the second highest valor award in the country, in a box, and the private conviction that the record would never be set straight, because the only men who could set it straight were in the ground. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the